am going to do something that is pretty much thinking out loud. Let me just speak a little bit about, this is a very special event for me. It's very sad that Sarah isn't here to give the lecture, but it brings together an insane number of people from my career, which I don't think I've ever had so many people together. Uwe was instrumental when I was an undergrad student, actually. Weirdly enough, no one studied the far right at that time, except, of course, the Germans. And so I sent out a letter, because there was no email, to 4 different professors in the rest of the world with suggestions for literature. And Uwe sent me back several books, which is amazing, but then also invited me to come and give a talk at the Universität of Bayreuth, which I did in kind of German as an undergraduate, which was an amazing experience and helped me phenomenally in my career. It also brings together, from, if Sarah would have been here, my first PhD student through my first PhD student at the UGA Jakob to my current PhD student, Gabriela, which is insane. And then Luke and I worked together at Edinburgh, which is almost as if I had planned a reunion. I didn't. But I was asked to reflect on the topic of the workshop, studying the far right and the far left, and that allowed me to go a little bit back to a literature that I haven't engaged with a lot, as well as reflecting a little bit on populism studies, if you want, which, despite the fact that people think I all the time work on populism, I actually don't. I haven't worked on populism in years, and I will tell you partly why. So first of all, I want to go back to totalitarianism theory, which fully outdated by now and probably not used much. It was introduced by Friedrich and Brzezinski during the height of the Cold War. And it brought together, and it was popularized by Hannah-Arendt, obviously, right? And it brought together fascism and communism. But the interesting thing is that theoretically, totalitarianism theory was actually more developed to look at the differences with authoritarianism rather than with democracy. And so the argument was that fascism and communism were similar in a way that they were a different form of authoritarianism, more ideological, more all-encompassing, etc. Now, it was later politicized and probably vulgarized in a way to kind of argue that communism was fascism. And of course, in the post-war period, like, fascism was ultimate evil. So if you could argue that communism was the same as Nazism, then there was no case to be made for it. And it then grew into what has become remarkably popular, one of those few concepts from social science that makes it into the public and then becomes almost more believed there than in academia, which is horseshoe theory. So the horseshoe theory is that the extreme left and the extreme right are kind of more similar than they're different. You can go to almost any journalist and they will buy that, right? It's extremely popular. In academia, there's actually not that much research into it, and there is a lot of skepticism about that thesis. But outside of that, it's very popular. But so those are kind of the origins of totalitarianism theory and study. I'm certainly not an expert on it. It didn't generate much in terms of political science, I would argue. A bit more history. So quite a lot comes through Arendt. This is probably not the place to say it, but not a specialist on Hannah Arendt. I have read her work on totalitarianism, very underwhelmed. I think almost everything that she argues about communism applies to communism, but not to fascism, and the other way around. I think this is a broader issue, actually. We quite often write about one extreme and then assume that it's correct for the other one, but we don't actually prove it. Now, to have another kind of cherished theory, you have extremismus theory, or extremism theory, which associated very much with Uwe Backus and Eckhard Jesse and others, was pretty influential, at least in my PhD period, which studied what was the extreme right and the extreme left together. It was very much in line with the German Constitution and with the understanding of militant democracy. It focused both on the similarities of the extreme right and the extreme left, but also the differences between the extreme and democracy. And so while it was by some people seen as a modern version of totalitarianism, it actually in origin was very different. As I said, totalitarianism studies was about totalitarianism versus authoritarianism, not so much totalitarianism versus democracy. Extremism theory was always contentious, and I think ultimately very German. There were very few scholars outside of Germany or who didn't have strong ties to German academia who worked in the tradition. There was an academic critique that it was focused too much on the individual, and I think in particular that it was blind towards the state. It didn't take the state into consideration in terms of how the extreme right and the extreme left operated. And there was a strong political critique, namely that it was too critical of the left and not critical enough of the mainstream. And so the argument was pretty much, yes, the right is extreme, but what you call the extreme left is actually just left. It also argued forcefully that while extremism theory, as well as kind of the constitution in Germany, has this kind of distinction between mainstream here, extremism there, as if there is no overlap. And this is what in radical right studies was normal pathology thesis, which is, I think, a very influential thesis, even though almost no one uses it explicitly. It was developed by Scheuch and Kligemann. It influenced very strongly the work of people like Betz without ever talking about it. And the idea was that the radical right, the values of the radical right, were kind of from a pre-modern period. They had nothing in common with liberal democratic values, and they were only supported by a small group of people who kind of couldn't deal with modern society. And that the potential of the far right was small outside of crisis. Only in terms of crisis could a large group of people have that. I've always been very critical of that, and I think, sadly, the last decades have shown that this distinction between mainstream and radical right is not as strong as we thought. Now, outside of Germany, in the 80s and 90s, I would argue that far left communist parties were an absolute minor topic, whereas the far right, under a broad variety of terms, became a huge topic, particularly in the 90s. And by the early 2000s, there are more people studying far-right parties than all other parties together, which is truly insane, given that even at the height today, far-right parties attract about a quarter of the vote. And so we have about, 30, 40% of all scholars studying 75% of the electoral votes going to parties. They were rarely studied together because they were completely different communities. There was a small group of scholars who studied communist parties. Sizable number came out of communist parties. Some sympathetic, others highly critical. And on the other hand, the far left was going down, and particularly after '89, people thought they will die, whereas the far right was going up. And so there was this idea that if you were going to study something extreme, just do the right, because the left one is going to go away. There's no reason to compare them. But then came populism. And the 21st century saw the rise of populism studies. And I would say comparative populism studies, although it's not so explicitly comparative. So before the 21st century, populism was studied mostly theoretical. Laclau, Canavan did very little empirical work. Or national, massive amount of literature in the US, mostly by historians about the populists. And then regional in Latin America. Even that wasn't strictly comparative. They would often just talk about Latin America as a region. There was an explosion of literature after 2016, and it's really Trump. You can actually see in Google searches as well as citations the Trump effect for studies. But it is also with 2016 and Trump that actually most populism has become right-wing. And so one of my critiques, about which I will come later, is that much of what is called generic populism studies actually studies right-wing populism. And given that my argument has always been that populism is a secondary feature for the right-wing populist, that is a big problem. There was a primary focus on the similarities of populism, but it was mostly assumed. It wasn't so much that they showed that the left populist and the right populist were populist in the same way. It was more that it was said that this one party was populist, this one was populist. And now we studied populism rather than explicit left-wing, right-wing comparisons, which have developed more recently. I would say that the secondary and implicit focus was often on the difference with democracy, but actually quite a lot of literature on populism, be it left or right, was just about what is populism. What does it want? What does it do? As said, there are relatively few comparisons between different forms of populism. I would say over the last 10 years that has changed a bit, both in terms of political sociology. There are some studies now about voters of left-wing populists compared to voters of right-wing populists. There's a little bit about what the parties stand for. And there is some critique of the equalization of left-wing and right-wing populism. It comes, I would say, mostly from the Laclauians. But it's nothing near as extreme as the critique that came from the left on extremism theory. As a side note, I assume quite a lot of you have read the work by Jan Wählermilieus, particularly his book, What is Populism? It's very interesting because he takes a pretty extreme position by excluding explicitly Syriza and Podemos, without saying actually too much about it, while at the same time not necessarily arguing that there isn't left-wing populism, but by excluding these two, the relevance of left-wing populism in Europe directly decreases to a lot less important parties. So with regard to the study comparatively of the far left and the far right, I want to focus on a couple of critiques and challenges. So, first of all, I'm not going to say too much about definitional issues, but I think at the moment, most of it is still done more under the heading of populism than specifically radical right, radical left. And it's an interesting terminological issue. Far right has become a much more common term recently. Far left is almost not used. Radical left is used, while radical right, unqualified, is used much less these days. It's radical right populist or populist radical right. But you don't have radical left populist much or populist radical left. You don't have far left. At the moment, we're very much into the hard right, which media love, which is completely vague, which I understand comes from Britain, where they use the term hard left, but no one else does. Actually, even far right, when I wrote The Far Right Today, I had endless fights with publishers for my translations because there was no equivalent. And they would always want to define it as extreme. And then, like in my conceptual formula, far right is radical right plus extreme right, right? Which would then translate as extreme right is radical right plus extreme right, which makes no sense. But publishers are much more concerned about language and whether people know it or not. And so it took me forever to have Latin languages, for example, agree on ultra. They didn't want that because that was used for ultras or for neo-Nazis. In Dutch and in German, like it was a literal translation, German was äußerst, awkward term as it is in Dutch, uiterst. But I think far right actually has become a much better term today, and I will explain that a bit better. My main problem with populism studies in general is, as I said, first of all, I would say most populism studies that does larger N comparisons, be it of parties or of voters, is disproportionately, if not overwhelmingly, study the right. And so if you think about the Norris and Engelhardt book, they have authoritarian populism, whatever the term means. Even if it does include, even if the classifications are correct, the simple fact is that the vast majority of successful authoritarian populist parties are right-wing populist parties. And in terms of absolute numbers, the number of voters that you have under the heading will be about 70 to 80% voters of right-wing populist parties. Now, if we know from studies, decades, 3 decades of studies, 4 maybe by now, that the overwhelming reason for people to vote for the far right is nativism rather than populism, and that nativism is not a core value, if a value at all, among left-wing populism, you have a major problem throwing them together. Right? And so at the very least, I think if you do comparative populism study, large N, and it doesn't have to be quantitative, but you should always test your results by separating them between left-wing and right-wing. And so if you find that cause A explains populist voting, you should check, does that also apply if I only look at the left-wing populist subset? Because obviously if 80% is right-wing, then if this is a very strong factor for the right wing, it will also be for the whole population. That's just basic mathematics. So I think that has become a big problem. And for example, again, going back to the book, like when you find that it's particularly social cultural reasons and displeasement with immigration that causes people to vote for the far right, that makes no sense in the context of Podemos or Syriza, which both are among the most pro-immigrant parties in their country. It does make sense if you know that left-wing populist parties and their voters are a small subset of the overall database that you have. So I think it's crucial to acknowledge that. But I think there's another problem in the comparative populism literature, and that is how populist is the far left. And this comes to an issue that we had in the 80s and 90s with the far right. And it is what my hero Giovanni Sartori called conceptual stretching. It means that you stretch out your term kind of to get more cases. So the big problem in the 1990s was that we had, and it was a great problem to have, we had too few successful far-right parties, which meant that anyone who was kind of critical about immigration would be added. By the same criteria today, virtually all but maybe two parties in the Netherlands would be anti-immigrant. Right? And so we stretched it. I think we're doing the same with the far left, and particularly with left populist. And the question is also for me, are the far left parties in particular, are they populist in the same way as right-wing populist parties? And importantly, to the same extent. If I think about a party in the Netherlands, like the SP, the Socialist Party, which I know reasonably well, the populism of the SP is nothing compared to the populism of Wilders or a Forum of Democracy. And I can go on because in the Netherlands we have an endless stream of right-wing populist parties. And so the only reason, if it would be a right-wing party, we would probably exclude them because we already have enough, right? But there is this kind of almost a desperation to find some left-wing populist parties. As a consequence, I think the bar to count a party as left-wing populist is much lower than the bar to be counted as a right-wing populist party. And so then the question, of course, is, are we comparing apples and oranges, right? Sure, there's still fruit, but there are different types of fruit. I'm not saying that there is no left-wing populist party, but by today's standards, Podemos, I don't think, can be counted as such. Syriza is problematic, but it has kind of a double face. It has a perhaps more populist discourse in Greece than outside of Greece. Die Linke, definitely not compared to the type of populism that you see on the right. The same for the SP in the Netherlands, perhaps PTB in Belgium. So you kind of end up with what, Mélenchon, Sarah Wagenknecht, if you want to call her left-wing. And so it's like the whole issue of left-wing populism, particularly with the decrease of left-wing populism in Latin America, for me is a bit of a question mark. I don't consider either Corbyn or Sanders as populist. So what are we talking about? And what is the value of putting a few reasonably irrelevant parties into a huge data set of incredibly important parties, namely right-wing populist parties that govern all over the place? So I think that we need to think a little bit more about that. I also think that we should think much more about the consequences of mainstreaming. While the whole concept of mainstreaming and normalization is not particularly well developed, there are actually some really interesting articles, I think, by Ben Moffitt, as well as by Mondon and Winter, about the term mainstream and the political connotations of that. For me personally, there's a fundamental difference between mainstreaming and normalization. Mainstreaming is empirical. It simply means that the positions or discourse or whatever you're interested in, policies of mainstream parties, former parties that made up the political mainstream, Christian democracy, social democracy, whatever, and the radical right, far right, whatever you want to call it, overlap. Normalization is, as the term says, normative. Normative is still ideological, but normative makes an argument that it isn't ideological. When things are normal, it means that they're not political, they're not ideological, or in Gramscian terms, it means they're hegemonic, they're above politics. The key concept for normalization is common sense. Right? And so one of the things that has become common sense is that multiculturalism has failed. There are some countries where it's not, but I can assure you in my country, if I would write an op-ed that multiculturalism has been a success, I would probably not get it published. But if I would get it published, then everyone would say I'm crazy, because everyone knows it has failed. That is common sense. Now, I think that the radical right, the far right, has become mainstreamed and normalized significantly, albeit with limitations. So while the radical right position on immigration has become mainstreamed, the radical right position on various other positions hasn't. And so we should be careful not to make the far right too powerful. If you look, for example, in foreign policy, particularly towards Russia, it was actually the far right that had to change its opinion to remain relevant. Right? You at the moment see some success in climate change debate, certainly not only from the far right. A lot of mainstream right wanted this but didn't dare to say it. Right? But on economic policy, far right has very little to say. So when I'm talking about mainstreaming, it is very specific in a field, but of course it is the prime field for the far right. But there is a consequence for populism of mainstreaming, logically. The reason of much of the populism was that they were marginalized. At the moment, in most countries, the far right is an acceptable partner to a sizable portion of the party system. In Denmark, they were already completely normalized by everyone in the 90s. Like the Social Democrats would send like representatives. In the Netherlands, depending on the party, the same. Austria goes back and forth, but secretly the SPÖ often negotiates with the FPÖ. And so what happens, someone like Meloni is not overly populist. Why would she speak about the elite as a whole when the vast majority of the right-wing elite works with her, accepts her? The Sweden Democrats are not very populist because the right-wing opened up to them and they opened up to them. And so, first of all, populism sometimes comes and goes. In opposition, it goes up. In power, it goes down. If you think about someone like Erdogan, Erdogan has populist episodes, I would say, as he has Islamist episodes. They seldom overlap. Sometimes he focuses more on Islamism, sometimes more on populism. Now, does that mean that populism is not an ideology? I find that a completely uninteresting question in most cases, but if you want to go for it, go for it. What is more important is that it means it's not permanent. It means that it changes, and we should accommodate that. I believe that we should also study much more differences between populist left and populist right, as well as the difference between the populist left and democracy and the populist right and democracy, rather than populism and democracy. And then if we look at those differences, we should ask what is specific to populism. So a lot of the research that we have at the moment about populist, generic, left and right, says, well, this is like populist. And, well, we have, of course, this whole wave that says it's all the 1930s again. But others say, well, this is what populists do. But most of it is just this is what authoritarians do. Populist or not populist. Some things is just what right-wingers do. Populist or not populist. We assume that if all populists do it, that this is specific to populism. And the reason is because we often compare populism to kind of anti-populist, to liberal Democrats. But if you compare populists to other illiberal Democrats, who might be elitist, right, what you will actually find is that certain features are not specific to populism. They're specific to illiberal Democrats or authoritarians, whatever the term is. The far right versus the radical left, which is roughly what the terms are. Right? I think one of the things that is interesting but missed is that although most of the far right is mainstream, we actually see a radicalization of the far right. Various far-right parties are more extreme today, at least openly, than they were in the 1990s. For example, various parties today use racial terminology, like Vlaams Belang, which the party was very, very careful about that. Never happened in the 1990s. And as a consequence, I think far-right is the better term today, because we have a lot of very relevant parties that are kind of hybridizations of radical right and extreme right. AfD was for a while. I think by now we're at the stage where they are in majority, particularly where the power is, extreme right. Fidesz, right? While on paper radical right, in practice extreme right. The Republican Party in the US, Likud in Israel, BJP, these are not unimportant parties. Right? These are some of the most fundamental parties. Bolsonaro, all of them on paper respecting democracy, right? In practice and in significant speech, not. I don't think we have the same on the radical left. I don't think we have a radicalization. I don't think we have too many hardcore extreme left parties left, maybe KKU in Greece. And so I think we should also look at how radical is the radical left. It's clear what the radicalism of the radical right is, or at least I think for most people is. It is that you have tensions with liberal democracy. Mostly minority rights, separation of powers, rule of law, things like that. Much harder to argue this in the case of radical left parties. And even if it's there, it would be nice to actually have an empirical study that shows it, rather than an assumption. Parties like Die Linke and the SP in the Netherlands are not anti-system in the same way as the AfD or the PVV are in their own country. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they shouldn't be in the same category, but I think we need to have an empirical study to show why they have to be in the same category. And as said, we have to think about what is the added value of comparing them. Sadly, we no longer need the numbers. Right? You can do all your studies on the far right. There's more than enough. So what is the value of adding a couple of reasonably marginal far left, radical left, left-wing populists to what do you want to achieve? So finally, I think there are three approaches to it from a theoretical point of view. You can study them as polar opposites of democracy, right, which is the horseshoe theory. I think it is useful. It often happens implicitly. One of the weaknesses, I think, of most of these studies is that it is far too forgiving in the illiberal aspects of the mainstream. And I think we still do that. We have this externalization of radicalism, of illiberalism. It's something of the parties there. If I look at my own country, my birthday gift today was amazing. My government fell. But over the last 3 elections, the party with the platform that was most against rule of law was the Conservative Party, the VVD. Was worse than Wilders. I'm not sure whether that is so exceptional. If I think about Austria, for example, then if you just look at the behavior of the ÖVP, then clearly we're faced with significant illiberal tendencies there. The Tories, even before the radicalization, but there are very illiberal aspects under Tony Blair's New Labour too. Like authoritarianism runs much deeper than the far right. And so one of the things that I think is important is to reintegrate kind of the radical right and to a certain extent the radical left in the study of the mainstream rather than separate from it, because they are. The idea of that you have these marginalized things on the side, very few of these parties are marginalized. We can also study them as polar opposites of each other, which is often how they present themselves. Right? So very much the far right, anti-communism, for example, has become a major issue, particularly in the Americas, but to a certain extent in various European countries too. Vote for us to stop the communists, the far left to come. Some of the radical left parties have the same. The Linke here, for example, RSP in the Netherlands, not. Mélenchon, very strongly. So studying them far more about ideologically, where are they polar opposites, where are they similar strategically? Do they try to attract the same voters? There's an assumption, often because both are protest parties. Actually, if you look at the profile, they have almost opposite profiles in voters. Often voters of radical left parties are young, urban, high educated, depending on the party. But if you think Die Linke, very much women. The far right, polar opposite, mostly not urban, low educated, male. And finally, and I think that's where it really is, particularly with the far right, I think we should look at it much more as broad boxes. I think we should, rather than just combine everything and add whatever, a few far left cases to the study of the far right and study far studies, whatever it is, we should actually compare within the box. The far right is so heterogeneous today that it almost makes no sense anymore to speak about the far right. There's almost nothing that the far right does. There's this idea that under COVID, the far right would disappear because it wouldn't have alternatives, right? Or then it would win because it was protest. But the far right is in government in certain countries. Why would it profit from protest events? A far-right party that gets 1% of the vote is not the same party as a party that gets 40% of the vote. A party that has 100 million members, the BJP, operates differently than a party with one member, the PVV. Right? All of these questions are important. Why don't we study why far-right parties fail? Actually, there are more far-right parties that have failed, even in the 21st century, than have succeeded. Right? There's virtually no study about it. Think about Vox in Spain. Right? By today's standards, Vox in Spain is a failure. Barely break out of 10%. Chega just had double of it. Right? I saw almost no study about them. And there's probably quite a lot to be said. Even the failure of DeSantis in the US is remarkable. Like, we now all do act as if it's totally logical that Trump is president again. It isn't. In 2022, a majority of Republican voters wanted to move on from Trump. Right? Everyone was waiting. I watched him at Mar-a-Lago, right, make his speech that he was entering the election. It was so boring that Fox News moved away, right? And 2 years later, he's president. Why? Because DeSantis implodes. But why does DeSantis implode, right? Well, you can say, well, Trump is so popular. No, he wasn't. Right? Why does Forum of Democracy implode? And Wilders, with one-person party, which allegedly cannot succeed, according to all literature, has the longest mainstay of virtually any party in the Netherlands. And so I think looking within cannot just tell us a lot about the far right, but also about mainstream politics. Because the reason why Wilders is successful is because he can play the mainstream game. Right? And so the reason why some parties fail is often not because they are too radical, but because they're unpredictable, or they don't live up to certain mores. Like we often thought, well, it's scandals, right? And every time that someone implodes, it's, well, a scandal. Yeah, of course, everyone has scandals. Right? You remember Gauland and his bird poop remark? Go back to the newspapers. Everyone thought that was the end. 10 years earlier, it would have been the end. Today, brushed away. Right? So when is something too much? And how does that change? And so I think that, going back to this, I think there is value to comparing whatever the term is of left and right. But I think it made much more sense in the 80s and 90s when most of the radical left and almost all of the radical right was truly marginalized and kept outside of the political mainstream. Today, I think if you do it, you should do it at least in a way that you don't implicitly present them as being detached from the political mainstream. Because whether we like it or not, there is no distinction like that anymore. And far right and far left have probably by now as much relevant things in common with the mainstream than that they have them apart. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Cas. So we now have a little bit of time for the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Cas, for this really thought-provoking keynote speech. It was really interesting to listen to it. It definitely made me think about something that, I mean, you've talked a lot about, obviously, the distinction between mainstream and populist, and you talked about, at the end, about the radicalization of, mainstream parties, which is an important aspect. But what can you say about the radicalization of anti-populism, of parties which are or organizations, movements, and so on, which were actively talking about, the populists are, the enemy, because we tend to think about basically the populists as the ones who are contributing to, for example, polarization, divisions in society. But what can we say about the other side, which is the anti-populist bloc, so to speak?
Yeah, I really like that. So I think that this is one of the things in which the work of Laclauens, and particularly Yanis Stavrakakis, has been very interesting, who kind of developed the concept of anti-populism. It's another thing where we externalize badness, in a sense, right? And so I remember the debate about Brexit. And so you had the evil Brexiteers and then you had the good Remainers, right? In the first years after the Brexit referendum, there was a fundamentally anti-democratic streak in the Remain discourse. which by and large wanted to overturn the results because either they were not informed enough, which coming from a state like Georgia, we have a long history of laws to keep uninformed people from voting. Or some arguments were, well, these people are going to die anyway, so why should they vote? Should they decide on our future? After Trump, there was a strongly anti-democratic discourse and the anti-populist thing. It's still there today. And so there are strongly authoritarian, illiberal, and anti-democratic discourses in mainstream discourse. I mean, here in the country, and I won't be popular for it, but I think militant democracy is a fundamentally anti-democratic discourse and system. It has a fundamental distrust of the people, which is actually shared, and was shared at least until the populist zeitgeist of the 21st century in Scandinavia, in the Netherlands. People should vote, but the elites should make sure that they make the right vote. And so we keep the bad ones out. So I think there is something. And if you talk about polarization, technically you can only have polarization when both sides radicalize. Right? And in that sense, I'm not a big fan of polarization, except perhaps effective polarization, because the left has in no way radicalized. Like, it's barely left anymore. There is only radicalization on the right. Now, we do see increasingly effective polarization. We saw it massively around COVID. We see it in the US strongly. And so, of course, that has this vicious circle, right? And now that justifies, for example, Trumpers to now believe, you see, they hate us, so we have to implement these type of policies. But I think that element is important. But again, for me, what is more important is to not have such a strict fundamental distinction between radical and mainstream.
Next question.
Thank you very much for the MIDEM. You mentioned the German perspective, and I would like to bring the Polish one, because in Polish research on populism, the dominant framework is the differentiation between the hard and soft populism. So for the ones who might not know, hard populism is the populism's ideology, thin it may be ideology. The soft one is the way, like a modus of doing politics. So what kind of rhetoric, what kind of arguments, how do you speak, how do you, it's basically a method and not an ideology. And my question is, would you say that maybe it might be a bit more fruitful path to focus on this kind of soft path, basically populism as a way of doing politics and not specific type of politics, for comparison between left-wing and right-wing populism? Thank you.
I think hard and soft populism is apple and oranges. They're just not the same thing, so why call them the same thing? I think what they share, because if you think about it conceptually, then you have hard and soft or subtypes of a form of populism. So what would be that? Probably speaking positively about the people. And that is so generic that under that you have all kind of different forms. I mean, one of my main problems with populism research today is that, everyone uses work from completely different conceptual frameworks. And so if you take work from Laclauians and you work with a definition like mine, they have nothing in common. Like Laclau describes politics in the most broad sense in his concept. Mine is much smaller. Most people who use my definition don't use it in the way that I use it. For me, it is absolutely essential that it's a moral distinction and that the groups are homogeneous. It's not whether you speak about the people positively and the elite negatively. And so, everyone does that at one time or another. And so, I now see all the time evidence that people are populist because they once said something positively about the people and something negative about the elite. That's this discourse. Right? So I think that use a different term. So there's a term called popularism, which is a funny term, and it kind of means much more pro-people discourse. Fine, but logically, and again, like I'm very Sartorian in that, the first question is either or. Are you a populist or not? And you have to have a clear distinction for that. The second question is what type of populist are you? And for me, I don't see really what the hard populist and the soft populist have in common outside of a very thin veneer. And I would go the same with Euroscepticism today. Like, soft and hard Euroscepticism made some sense perhaps in the 1990s. But if now the only thing that is Eurosceptic is having some negative or skeptical position on Europe, there are no non-Eurosceptics. And then it's a useful category, a useless category, I think. I know it's a bit harsh, but
you propose to compare successful and non-successful far-right parties. I find this very interesting, and relatedly, focusing on the theme of the conference, what about comparing an electorally strong party family, the far right, and the electoral defeat of the radical left? How are these two phenomena related to each other? There was once a great book by a German political scientist, Philipp Marmo, on the political economic reasons for why the far left in Southern Europe is much bigger than in Northwestern Europe, but to me it seems that the differences have become much smaller now. You once wrote about the defeat of Syriza, so I wonder, do you have a take on this? To what extent are these two phenomena, a very successful party family on the far right, a quite unsuccessful one on the far left, related to each other? Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think that's it. I think there was an interesting element there, I think it mostly had to do with what dominates the discussion, whether it's socioeconomic or sociocultural, and the reason why it was there, right? It was the countries that are socioeconomic. At the same time, again, like, while you can make an argument that the far right is successful in Europe, or EU Europe, it is even problematic to argue that the far left is successful in the South. It wasn't successful in Portugal. It wasn't successful in Italy. The same as, like, we talk about the pink wave in Latin America. There are only 3 left-wing populist governments. It's a pretty big continent, right? And so we generalize on the basis of a few cases. Sure, you can call everyone a left-wing populist, like Kirchner and Lula and Bachelet, but it was actually really just Correa, Chavez, and Morales, right? And maybe Nicaragua, you can add to that. That's a minority of the whole thing. And so I think that's often my problem. Like, yes, Syriza and Podemos were both very relevant and got a lot of attention in the media. Podemos was a short-term phenomenon, unlike Syriza, where the populism was problematic. And so that comparison is still, the far left element is not equal to the far right element. Like, the success of the far right in Northern Europe is both much more comprehensive in terms of regional coverage, as in terms of electoral support, as in terms of temporal endurance, than that of the far left in the South. So it's not that I'm against it, but like, after that, we should kind of also start to ask the other question. Why Spain and Greece, but not Portugal and Italy?
It's always inspiring to listen to your talks, Cas. Thank you a lot. You have tackled the concepts of extremism, radicalism, populism. When I look at the slide here, left and right are at the top of the slide. Do you think it's still adequate to address predominantly political issues by the labels left and right. I mean, these historical issues have a long history from the French Revolution on. But if you look at the issue positions of parties and voters, it becomes harder and harder to address them only with this one-dimensional left and right term. And so, you address, for instance, Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, but there are other parties which mix issue positions which some positions like on migration can be labeled as right, while others on the socio-economic dimension may be labeled as left. And how I'm interested how you what do you think how we should deal with that?
I think it's a good question. I use left and right in the sense of Norberto Bobbio, which is kind of a meta interpretation of left and right, which focuses on equality, pretty much, and the idea that the right thinks that inequalities are natural and should be left outside of the purview of the state, which also means that, for example, neoliberalism is right-wing. Because even neoliberalism believes like that the market creates inequalities and that's good. The left believes that inequalities are created and that the state should make a more equal society. Now, is that perfect? No. There are parties like Sarah Wagenknecht, like the Danish Social Democrats, which combine strongly left-wing egalitarian discourses socioeconomically and strongly unequal discourses socioculturally. They are fairly marginal still. Right? And so, look, no conceptual framework is going to apply to everything. I think in some questions it isn't that important. I am, however, very much an ideology scholar. And ideology has never been particularly popular in political science. The Marxists always hated it. Then the rational choice theory, people didn't like it. Now everything is psychology. And then you had the pragmatists. I still believe that everything is ultimately ideological. All terms that we use, and I think at the moment, that's the reason why the left is failing. And so I think even if parties themselves behave and pretend not to be ideological, like Rutte or Blair or Schröder or almost everyone these days, certainly Starmer, right? It doesn't mean that their discourses don't have ideological meaning. And I think they are overall consistent. But I always found that whether, your approach depends on your question. So, for example, I do think there is value in studying the far left and the far right for certain things. For other things, it makes much more sense to study the far right and the mainstream right. Sometimes you just study mainstream parties, and left and right is not important. So I think you should have a combination, but you should always reflect for what I'm interested in. What is the best concept to use? And define your concepts. That's always useful, right? But thinking about left and right purely in a socioeconomic sense, that makes no sense today in European politics.
Okay, thanks, Cas. There's many things I could ask you, but I will stick to this one. To what degree do most analysts of the populist right are they critics of the populist right, and to what degree are most analysts of the populist left supporters of the populist left, and to what degree is that a problem?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I live in the US, and most of my colleagues don't care about politics, so they have no positions on anything, pretty much. Of course they do, but not openly. we also should not underestimate this. We have more and more colleagues who are either neutral towards the far right, if not sympathetic to it. And I'm not only talking about Matthew Goodwin, I'm talking about a growing group. I find this personally a major problem, and I find it really annoying that far too few colleagues are willing to call out other colleagues. Having done this for many years, I can tell you don't make yourself very popular with it. But there are quite a lot. Right? I'm not so sure in the last literatures that I saw that I find actually, so this was the case very strongly with communist parties. It was insane with green parties. Like almost everyone who wrote about green parties in the 1990s was an active member of a green party. Everyone who wrote about the far right was anti-far right. At the moment, that is much less the case. It's still the dominant position, but much less. I don't think it's that strong outside of, even the Syriza clique became largely dissatisfied with Syriza. Like every bias, right, creates blind spots. I strongly believe that we all have biases, and I'm not against them either. I think they're human. I think it's important that we are aware of them and that we're open about them. Like, so I always get criticized for being left-wing and for saying that I'm left-wing. It's even on my wiki site. And so every journalist will talk about it. Right? And then there's this assumption that I'm this left-wing political professor and that you have all these other professors who are completely neutral. Right? And that's, of course, bullshit. Right? I do think that, in general, I would think that probably if you're strongly sympathetic, you're more blind than if you're purely negative. But if I mean, like Uwe, I've been at this very long, and I think Uwe has far more energy than me. I dream of retirement. But if I compare the study of the far right today with the study of the far in the 80s, 90s, you can't compare it. Like, I mean, I literally once, when I gave a talk in Nijmegen about the far right, someone stood up, and I already saw him like shaking during my talk. And he stood up and he shouted at me, "Are you going to say that your research is to the betterment of the victims of fascism?" And I was taken aback, like I was a grad student. I said, "Well, I just tried to get my PhD." And he stormed out. Like, actually happened. Right? I have been accused in this country and others of normalizing the far right because I studied them with mainstream political science concepts and theories. That won't happen anymore. Or maybe in Britain, but certainly not where I live. And so I think it's better. I mean, the one thing is that if people, like, I don't like US political science very much. People study things that they've never engaged in. Right? And I think that's the problem still with the far right. Too many people write about the far right who never actually went to a meeting. But the weirdest thing is, too many people study the far right who think they don't know the far right. Like, I have people around me, I mean, everyone knows, like, or can Google my Wikipedia site. My brother used to be far right. Fascinated everyone. Today still. Like, I live in a state where 50% votes for Trump. You seriously think you know no one who supports Trump? Every single person, almost all of my students have a dad who supports Trump. But we don't consider that far right. No, if you know a neo-Nazi, like, that is it. And so I think that for me, these biases, they're only problematic if you're not reflective on it. And as said, they're nothing compared to the 1990s, where the study of the radical left, many were former communists, but certainly the Greens.